Latham has made a very, very powerful point about the same-sex marriage issue. Now, I know people are tired of this, but I said a couple of weeks ago, we can't afford to be tired of this. We've got to see where this is heading. And he is making the point, Mark, and I'll get him to amplify this, that the Australian Bureau of Statistics advertisements are encouraging people to vote on, quote, whether Australian marriage laws should be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry. And so, if that proposition's carried, the average voter would expect extra clauses, as Mark has said, to be added to the Marriage Act, widening the scope of wedlock to include same-sex couples. But Mark Latham is making the point that when Mr Shorten introduced his private members' marriage amendment marriage equality bill in 2015, its purpose was to allow Australians to marry regardless of their sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status. So basically, Mark, the Bureau of Statistics are saying we're voting on whether we allow same-sex couples to marry. Shorten, supported by the Liberal Party, is saying marriage can be a union between any two people.
Yeah, it's a huge inconsistency, isn't it? You know, it's a real anomaly that's been set up by the Turnbull government where we're voting on one question, but the parliamentarians are planning to legislate on a different question that gives a much broader definition and approval of various forms of marriage. And in fact, if you look at the left-wing material they've developed, there's an extra 247 gender and sexual categories that are defined. I don't understand what some of these things are.
well, let me just explain. This is brilliant. Mark has identified this. The way I think about Mark Latham, he does his homework, and he's identified up to 250 gender and sexual categories. Now, he's a bit lost. I'm a bit lost. I mean, we're half familiar with this LGBTI. Most people don't know what it stands for: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. But you say it's possible to be genderqueer, demisexual, two-spirit, asexual, pansexual, polyamorous, fluid, femme, gender binary, gynophilic, SARB, whatever the hell these are, MSM/WSW, scoliosexual, agender, androsexual, bicurious, cisgender, demiromantic, down low, Ross has given up here, MTF/M2F. Now, you make the point that you're a supporter of same-sex marriage, as am I. I'd be happy if two people, of the same sex love one another. That's their business. But at the same time, that's not what the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are talking about.
Exactly. And I'd happily vote for a change to the Marriage Act, which brought in two gay men or two lesbian women in the institution of marriage. But that list of strange words and definitions that the average Australian really wouldn't know much about, I don't know anything about them, all those categories are being included in the legislation that's proposed. So
any two people can marry, yep.
A big gap between the question that's being asked of the people...
Same-sex couples, or any two people can marry, yeah.
Things are going to come in, and it begs the question, all these other definitions are based on gender fluidity. If we don't want gender fluidity in the Safe Schools program, why would we legislate it and bring it into the Marriage Act?
It's a very valid question. I mean, the postal vote question is asking about same-sex couples, not the other 247 types of marriage being promoted by the left. And they are saying, and of course this is part of the Liberal Party thing and the Bill Shorten bill, marriage equality not for same-sex couples. According to the Liberal and Labor Party, there's a sweeping, and Mark's made this point, redefinition of marriage, extending it to other 247 gender sexual categories. So you're saying to people, if they don't understand the proposal, don't vote for it. I mean, this is a powerful setback, really, for the Yes campaign, because the definition is blurred.
It's a huge issue, and what the Turnbull government should do is publicise and let people know about the legislation they're planning to bring in. Let's see the legislation that the Turnbull government would introduce to the Parliament if there was a yes vote. That way people would know exactly what they're voting on. Correct. At the moment, the legislation that Bill Shorten brought in and Liberals like Dean Smith have brought to their party room allows marriage between any two people. of any gender, any sexuality. So it's the broadest possible definition, whereas most people think we're just going to approve same-sex marriage. It's same-sex marriage plus the other 247 extra categories and definitions. So Turnbull should publicly make available the legislation, say to people, this is what you're actually voting on, to clear up all this confusion.
Now, can this be, and we don't want to be alarmist here, and we ought to be able to have a civilised and decent debate respecting the views on both sides, but nonetheless we're entitled to be worried whether this may not lead to this notion of gender fluidity, that is, as in this Safe Schools program in our schools, or respectful relationships infiltrating our education system, a campaign out there to convince young people of the possibility of gender fluidity. This is worrying parents, that at any time a boy can become a girl and a girl become a boy if you feel like it.
Oh, it's dreadfully worrying for parents, and there's been a sleight of hand here, Alan, because the left started campaigning for gay marriage, and then they called it same-sex marriage, and then they called it marriage equality, and everyone thought this was just a marketing exercise, an exercise in semantics. But when they moved from same-sex marriage, so gay couples, to marriage equality, what they actually meant was they're bringing in every single one of these 247 extra sexuality and gender definitions. Marriage equality is basically everyone and every sexuality under the sun that they can define. So there's sort of been mission creep here. You know, the left have moved
This is a very
the
valid
broadest
point you're
possible
making.
definition without telling people in Australia this is what they're going on about.
Ross is nodding his head here. This is a very, very big issue. We're grateful for Mark Latham raising all of this. I mean, the majority of parents don't want this stuff in the school curriculum, but if it finds its way into the Marriage Act, the next step then is to say, well, this is all very legal, therefore this can be taught in our schools.
Oh, absolutely. Teaching the Marriage Act would be valid. No one can, technically complain about teaching the Marriage Act in the classroom. But if the Marriage Act includes all these gender fluidity characters and categories, then it's a backdoor way of introducing gender fluidity into the curriculum. And what can anyone say about it? It will be in the Marriage Act, according to the legislation that Shorten and others have put up.
It's incumbent upon both sides, therefore, to define what the legislation will state, isn't it? Both on the yes and on the no side.
Absolutely. In politics, Alan, it pays to look at the detail.
Yeah.
And last week I thought, well, I'm going to go and have a look at the private members' bills that have been introduced to the Parliament, and I asked a few Liberals what's happened in their party room, and they said it's the broadest possible definition, marriage between two people, and it goes way beyond same-sex couples. So I thought, well, there's the detail, and there's the inconsistency with the question that's being asked by the ABS. This has become a bit of a sham. And Turnbull needs to table the legislation so the country can know what it's actually getting into.
It's another manifestation of leadership, isn't it? I mean, Turnbull just doesn't know what he stands for. He just wants to have a trophy. And if he thinks he can leave office before he's thrown out of office by having same-sex marriage, quote-unquote same-sex marriage, then he thinks he'll have hairs on his chest. But, I mean, as you say, this now has become a wolf in sheep's clothing.
It has, and it complicates the issue into the future. Say, hypothetically, the people vote yes, and they thought they were just voting for same-sex marriage. Conservative MPs in the Liberal Party room would be entitled to say, hang on, we're not going for this broad definition.
Absolutely.
The public haven't voted for it.
Absolutely. We've got to go.
Change the Marriage Act just to include gay men and lesbian women.
We've got to go.
Add those two into the Marriage Act, along with the traditional definition that's there at the moment. And that's all that can happen because that's the mandate of the people.
We've got to go, Mark. Mark, we've got to go.